Today is the final week of our fall series, Classroom for Christians, in which we've been learning from Jesus as he teaches and tells stories. This particular scripture you're going to hear is a good one to end with because it sums up what Jesus teaches us in just a couple of sentences. It's like the capstone class in our program. It's also a good scripture to think about if you've been watching the news lately, particularly the confirmation hearings of the nominee to the Supreme Court. If you like questions of law and interpreting the law as I do, you've probably been learning a lot if you watch those hearings. This scripture concerns some scholars of the law and interpretation of the law and the practice of the law. Let's listen to Jesus' teachings to us today in Matthew 22, verses 34 through 46. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment of the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question, "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, "How is it then that David, by the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Did you know that there are still 4 states in the United States in which you can become a lawyer without ever spending even one day in law school? Yep, it's true. It isn't easy, but in California, Vermont, Virginia, and Washington, you can read law. You can study law under the mentorship of a lawyer or a judge. You just study and study and study, and then you take the bar exam, and if you pass, you're a lawyer. Reading the law, that's how everyone did it until the 1890s. And in the first century, in Jesus' time, the Pharisees were scholars of the law, those who read the law. They read the Bible. Remember now, in Jesus' time, the Bible was only the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and you became a lawyer by studying the law. Now, there's another definition of reading the law, and that has to do with a way of interpreting the law. Certain lawyers and Supreme Court justices read the law as originalists. They read law with the intent of trying to understand what the words meant originally. That is to say, when the founders wrote the Constitution, they had certain meanings and intentions in mind, and the way to interpret the laws and apply them now is to figure out what they meant then. It sounds really good. But when those founders wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," they meant not all men, but all white men who held property. They did not imagine an America where people of color had equal rights. They did not imagine an America where women were able to live and vote as full citizens. What they meant originally is not what we take it to mean now. Now, some people read the Bible as originalists. They ask, what is the so-called plain meaning of the text? And whatever they decide it says, is what they believe it says for all time and eternity. There are a couple of problems with that, though. The most obvious issue is we can't always know what they meant then. And so we can end up reading poetry as if it is journalism, or history as if it is poetry. We could end up reading the letter of the law like originalists instead of looking for the bigger picture of who God is and what God does. See, the Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus into saying something that went against the original intent and meaning of God's law. They asked him, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And he answered them with the words from the Shema, the words from the Torah that are the centerpiece of morning and evening prayers for Jews. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Well, of course, these learned scholars could not argue with that. It is the greatest and first commandment, and they knew it. They also knew the rest of the law Jesus quoted. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So their trick question was a flop. Their trap failed. They knew it. Jesus knew it. Everyone standing there listening knew it. Love God with all your substance. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's the most important thing. It's the greatest commandment in the law. There's no nuance of meaning, no multiple ways of interpretation on this one. Love God. Love your neighbor. When Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross, he reminds his friends again with a new commandment, love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. If we don't learn anything else in this classroom for Christians, that is the worshiping congregation, we ought to learn this. The most important law is love. I'm afraid that sometimes it would be hard to identify Christians if the evidence we're looking for is their adherence to this greatest of all the commandments. If the law is to love God and love neighbor, I dare say that a lot of Christians are lawbreakers. Some of our neighbors believe that wearing a mask is an infringement on their individual rights, and some seem to think that anyone who does wear a mask is a fool. I would ask, how are you reading the law? There are churches gathering and singing and praying in worship without precautions or with minimal precautions, and they seem to believe that their wishful thinking is faith. And I would ask, how are you reading the law? The virulent sin of racism continues to infect us like a virus, and some are reading Black Lives Matter as a statement that is anti-police instead of pro-Black lives. We seem unable to grasp the reality that we can fight racism and support police officers at the same time. I would ask, how are you reading the law? We really can love our neighbors, all our neighbors. And until Black Lives Matter as much as white lives, we need to remind ourselves that Black lives matter to God and to us. People are growing more and more harsh in their judgments of others as we approach the general election, and certain of our candidates won't denounce white supremacy or conspiracy theories that are simply nonsense. Some of our neighbors are of the opinion that you can't be a Democrat and still be a follower of Jesus. Some of our neighbors are of the opinion that you can't be a Republican and still be a follower of Jesus. And I would ask them, how are you reading the law? I have it on good authority that God is neither a Republican or a Democrat, not a member of any political party. But there's something else important to know about the law, something well worth considering in our time, especially as we consider the current situation in our country. Lawyers don't just read law, they practice law. Practice. One lawyer writes, "The practice of law is called a practice because it involves constant attention, reflection, and evolution." constant attention, reflection, and evolution. We are called to love God and love one another, and to love our neighbor. We're also called to love our enemy. I don't know about you, but I'm finding that pretty challenging right now. To follow that great commandment requires my full attention. I can't just give it lip service. Oh yeah, I love God, I love others. I need to attend to it. Psalm 1 says, "Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked or take the path that sinners tread or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night." I'm a follower of Jesus. How do my thoughts, my words, and my actions demonstrate love? You are a follower of Jesus. How do your thoughts, your words, your actions demonstrate love? To practice the law, we need to reflect on it before we make that comment on Facebook, before we make that gesture in traffic, before we make that face. And thirdly, to practice the law of love involves constant evolution. That means our love needs to be always developing, growing, even changing according to our situation. What it meant to love your neighbor in the year 33 AD has changed, but the commandment has not. Back in the first century, loving God and loving neighbor might mean going to the synagogue, making an offering, and giving bread or a coin to a beggar. Then, as now, devoting attention and reflection to loving God involves worship and prayer and the study of Scripture and an openness to God's Spirit moving in our lives. Today, it may also mean making regular gifts to the church and its work. Today, loving our neighbor may mean offering ourselves to justice work. Loving a neighbor nowadays might look as colorful as chalk art on the sidewalk, or as simple as a few words on a card. Loving our neighbor nowadays may simply look like wearing a mask. I invite you this week to engage in the practice of love, in attention, reflection, and evolution. To quote another teacher of the faith, "And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love." Don't just read the law. Practice it. Practice love.